Ooh, what's good? My name's Axotol, and Kingdom Hearts is finally released on Steam. Now, there are three kinds of people that I'm trying to reach out to. One, the people that have already played through the game multiple times on every release, like me. Two, those people that can't make up their mind. And lastly, those that want nothing to do with the series but decided to give me a chance anyways. Although I doubt that they would be watching in the first place, but, you know, it is what it is. Anyways, hello to all. Now, there's a few things that I want to touch on before the nitty-gritty of everything. By making this video, I'm not telling you to go out and play every game. I cannot stress this point enough, not every game is essential to play. The next thing is the different versions of the game. There are three coming to Steam. The Kingdom Hearts HD 1.5 2.5 Remix, the HD 2.8 Final Chapter, and simply Kingdom Hearts 3 with its bundled DLC. The important ones are 1.5, 2.5, and 3. While there is some important story stuff in 2.8, you can at least find the cutscenes online somewhere, and in my opinion, the only playable game isn't really for me, so yeah. Real quick, I recommend starting with 2, as Kingdom Hearts 1 is pretty old and didn't age well at all. Some diehard fans will tell you otherwise, but in my opinion, 2 is just much more digestible for newer players. 1 just feels like a really old game and it'll hit you pretty hard. So I'll start with 2. It'll be a little confusing at the start, but if you pay attention to some cutscenes in the prologue, you'll figure the first game out. I believe in you. Okay, now getting into the nitty gritty, we'll leave the actual gameplay stuff for last, and don't worry, I'll timestamp it somewhere because that's the bulk of the video. Firstly, I think what puts a lot of people off is the awkwardness of the whole Disney and Final Fantasy amalgamation of a game, but in the end I think it's alright. If you think the Disney side is more of a setting kind of thing, then I actually like it. There's a lot of cool things you can do, like the tournaments from Olympus, and the art style and details of going to an old school Steamboat Willie World, complete with film grain and distorted audio, as well as old Donald and Goofy models. If you take the Disney side lightly, like the games themselves do, it's pretty cool. Now, the Final Fantasy stuff is definitely thrown in there, and there's a pretty big reason for that. They needed more characters to fill out the game, and while they added original characters like Sora and Riku, they didn't have enough character to them, as their stories are just beginning. And it's okay, I guess. We got to fight Sephiroth a couple times, and boy oh boy, beating him in Kingdom Hearts 2 on the hardest difficulty was my greatest achievement as a 10-year-old kid. For better or for worse, the whole Final Fantasy stuff dies down quite a bit because we got way more original characters to fall in love with. A little bit too many to keep track of, honestly, but we love everyone here. Except Donald, because he never heals in time. Next is the story. Oh boy, here we go. I'm not going to explain the story behind everything because it's been done, thankfully, multiple times over multiple years. But I will say this, the story is really long and there's a lot of moving parts. I mean, the first game came out more than 20 years ago, so you are coming into it pretty late. It's not so bad when you're going through playing the story, as long as you pay attention. There's also an in-game journal that keeps track of everyone you meet and who they are, as well as what you, the player, has done. This includes Disney stuff and, more importantly, non-Disney stuff. But honestly, the overarching story is not bad for people that are used to more convoluted storylines. Hell, I mean, if you can understand the story behind any big franchise, then this shouldn't be a problem for you. Just be ready to have a lot of vague descriptions and weird decisions like Heartless and Nobody being the opposite of what they're actually called, or something like the characters' hearts not being their soul, but they also are. I don't really know about that one to this day. I guess it's more like their personality, sentience. I don't really know. I'm sure somebody has already explained it though. It's a mess, but it's our mess. Except the third game, that individual story is so poorly written, even for a Kingdom Hearts game. Like, the pacing is absolutely miserable. And now, the combat. Holy crap, the combat. Speaking mostly from Kingdom Hearts 2 perspective, this is some of the cleanest, crispest combat you'll probably ever encounter. For the most part, the Kingdom Hearts series is a hack and slash game, especially going through the story. For most of it, as well as depending on difficulty, you can mash the attack button and be just fine. The best way to describe the general combat is that while Souls-like games are more weighty and each hit has a kind of separate space between them, Kingdom Hearts is more of a dance to the death. I'll touch more on this later, but for right now, the combat is surprisingly fast for a 20-year-old game. For the lower difficulties, most normal enemies die before even one combo is complete. For the beefier guys, you gotta be a little bit more careful, as hyper armor is a major mechanic in these games, and spamming can get you hit more times than not. Throughout most of the games, you're kind of on a small power trip, especially towards the end of the stories. The bosses, however, are a much different topic, but we'll get to that later. From here on out, I guess this is kind of a minor spoiler alert, as I'm going to start mentioning specific things from the games. Now, let's talk gameplay. First comes the lock-on system. This is pretty much identical to any of these Souls-likes that have come out after the first Kingdom Hearts. You press one button and you get to single all of your attacks on that specific enemy. This seems pretty simple at first, but with a few abilities, this has you flying across rooms, dodging other attacks, knocking your foes into the air, and without missing a beat, following them while restarting your combo counter. And while you don't have to lock onto anything, these games are balanced around the lock-on mechanic to the point that there are abilities built with it in mind. This allows the combat to be a lot easier to control with all the dashing and jumping, while some enemies are flying and teleporting around. If you don't feel like locking on, that's also okay, because there is a soft lock system that has an icon usually marking the closest enemy, in which case you'll focus on them. Now, there are no light or heavy attacks, just one combo with finishing moves that can change depending on certain abilities, which you can mix and match. And while at first this sounds kind of lame and unintuitive, the way the game handles the combos itself isn't entirely based on specific button inputs, but it's based on where you are in relation to the enemy you're locked onto. This is a hack and slash game, not a fighting one. Hey! You like to gap close? The answer is yes, by the way, you're gonna need it. There's an ability that overrides your first hit, making it into a dash if you're far enough away. Well, what if you're too close? Instead, you can override that first hit differently and have it be 3 hits that have AoE potential. You like air combos over ground ones? Well, it turns out that you don't even need to press the jump button. You can launch the enemy and have Sora follow them up into the air, restarting the combo counter. Oh, what's that? You don't like having long and complicated combos? Well, why don't you just equip enough negative combos and spam one finisher move? And those are just the standard physical attacks. I haven't even gotten into the magic and form changes yet, and let me say this, you can also string those into your combos. But sadly, the fact that the basic combo is enough is probably why it feels like a very button mashy game at face value. It feels like, and I can't stress that enough, feels like you can spam attack to win. That's one of the downsides to this series, is because of how easy this can be, you can get away with equipping all these fancy abilities without even reading them, and breeze through most, if not the entire story, pressing one button. This sets up a false expectation that doesn't really teach the player much of anything, only for them to start getting bodied towards the end or post-game bosses. Now, I mentioned magic and form changes before, and those vary immensely between each game. There are also these things called shot locks, which is a different combat mechanic, but for simplicity's sake, I'll talk about Kingdom Hearts 2 and 3, as those are probably the best, if not the most played in the series. Now, starting with magic, you get a mana bar. I know, pretty crazy, but stay with me here. Every spell you use takes up a specific amount of mana. Crazy, right? In Kingdom Hearts 2, there are 3 damage and then 3 more support type spells, specifically Fire, Blizzard, and Thunder, 4 damage, and Magnet, Reflect, and Cure. In Kingdom Hearts 3, there are Fire, Blizzard, Thunder, Water, Arrow, and again Cure. Even the way the game handles the same elemental spells are very different from each other. I don't want to go too in depth into what they actually do, but what I will say again is that you can incorporate different spells into different parts of your combo. I should mention that the spells get upgraded at different parts of the story, but I'll go more into that later on. Now, Cure is the odd spell out. At every rank, it is a full heal. The different ranks only increase the range at which it applies. What makes it unique is the fact that it uses all of your mana. It doesn't cost all of it, it just uses the rest of it. This means that you can use it whether you have 100 mana or 1. Now, why does this matter? Well, there lies the beauty of the mana system. If you run out, it starts a timer. During this timer, you cannot use magic at all, which means your combos might be weaker, or you can't heal without items. If you mess up, do you risk having that extra crowd control and damage, or heal and use up all of your mana? Yes, having that kind of cure gives you a second chance, but now you're at risk of dying. There are a lot of decisions that are presented from this one mechanic. Yes, there are always health and mana recovery items, but those are limited per fight. You can also get items that heal all of your and your teammates' health and mana, but those are very rare or very expensive. Now, there are plus sides to being out of mana. There are a lot of abilities that span off of having no mana, but since they all have very different uses, I won't go too in depth into what those actually are. Either way, mana is very important in the games that have them, so you're going to use it eventually. Now, moving on to form changes. These aren't really all that complicated, but they are worth their own video. Kingdom Hearts 2 is the first game to have this kind of mechanic. What they essentially do is that for a limited time, Sora gets very strong one way or another. Whether it's through stat increases and or different movesets, it's Sora's time to go all out. In Kingdom Hearts 2, you had to manually traverse the tiny menu and select which form you wanted, which kinda took away from the pacing of the combat, but at least you could combo off of the transformation explosion, so it has a lot of potential if done right. Birth by Sleep and Kingdom Hearts 3 handles them a bit differently. Birth by Sleep has you transform automatically, but which form you took on was based on the kind of attacks you were doing. Normal attacks got you a powerful physical form, while fire attacks got you the fire-based form. In Kingdom Hearts 3, the forms are tied directly to your Keyblade, and when you fill the bar up, you get a 45-second-ish window to activate it. I should mention that changing forms gives a few iframes that you can abuse to dodge attacks you're struggling with, or at the very least interrupt enemies from attacking, but those change per game. While there's a ton of different forms throughout all of the games, they all fall into the usual categories. Things like more damage and massive AoE potential, but little defensive options, or forego melee attacks altogether for a ranged option that abuse magic even easier, or even a defensive form that rewards you for blocking attacks or dodging easier by teleporting around the battlefield. There are some unique forms as well, like the ultimate type ones, and some hidden ones that have huge drawbacks, like not being able to heal, but I won't show any of those because stumbling into them is a great feeling. Now, shot locks are a special mechanic added in Birth by Sleep. This allows you to lock onto enemies and do a bunch of damage. These aren't really magic moves as they don't use the mana bar, but are more like cool animations that dish out a ton of damage. In Birth by Sleep, you get access to a lot of them, and some have unique ones per character, but in Kingdom Hearts 3, these are again locked behind the individual Keyblades. There's not much more to say about these except some might do less damage, but heal you a little bit, others might give you a ton of iframes, and some are just a giant cannon that nukes everything in a given direction. These are more like signature moves or special moves that you can pull off if you have enough focus for them. There's not much interaction other than hold a button down and wait for the lock on and press a different button, but these games are built with this mechanic in mind, so as broken as they may seem, they don't really take away or add much and are just there to look really cool. There's also mobility defensive stuff that comes in the form of a block, dash, or dodge roll, as well as a button that lets you jump, double jump, and in most games eventually fly. Fly. And while there's not many interactions that Sora can do with those except for riposts, there are things like unblockable attacks, or attacks that you can only dodge while in the air, or attacks that you can only dodge if you're moving fast enough. And some fights you have to chain everything together in a specific way, as a lot of bosses will string together their own combos. But that's more along the lines of enemy design rather than what Sora can do. There's also flow motion, but I tend to think of that as more of a gimmick rather than a useful mechanic. It's pretty much a traversal thing that lets you bounce off of walls and swing around poles and stuff, which can help in mob fights and do a good chunk of damage, but leave you pretty vulnerable in my opinion. And lastly, there's a special move interaction button, which varies greatly depending on the game. For example, Kingdom Hearts 2 lets you interact with enemies. Birth by Sleep lets you use your custom moveset, and Kingdom Hearts 3 activates the Keyblade form changes or finishing moves. It's most prevalent in Kingdom Hearts 2 though, as a lot of enemies have their own interactions with the button. Some let you go into a standoff where time is frozen, and if you press the right button quick enough, lets you one-shot them. Other times it's just an easy win with a button that plays a cutscene type animation that might progress the fight. And while this interaction is more of a gimmick, it really gives the enemies more character than you would expect. For the rest of the games, however, it really comes down to just activating an ability, whether if it's the command deck from Birth by Sleep or changing forms or grand magic from Kingdom Hearts 3, it really doesn't do much past that. Now, time to talk about the other half of combat, enemy design. I'll break these down into 3 different categories: mob enemies, story bosses, and what I like to call them, super bosses. And yes, they definitely live up to that name. Starting with mob enemies, these are your basic enemies that you'll fight throughout the entirety of the main story. We'll break them down into 2 parts, normal and elite enemies. Keep in mind that these are my kind of categorization of them and no official terminology. Normal enemies don't have a lot of health and not a lot of damage either. Overall, they're not too crazy. The most basic enemy is called a shadow. They kind of just stand around and every hit you do will stun lock them. Not the most dangerous enemy, but since they can phase into the ground and become invincible, they can sneak up on you and get a hit in. Most enemies usually have some gimmick and 1 or 2 moves that they can use. There's a bunch of flying enemies and some literally teleport away from you and snipe you from across the map. The normal enemy design is pretty easy to handle by themselves, even in big groups because of how much AoE potential Sora has. They're really more of a distraction for the elite type guys. Now, the elite enemies are pretty dangerous and on higher difficulties will definitely kill you if you get sloppy. These guys usually have a gimmick that stops the button mashing or hit you so hard that you'll stop yourself. The first one you'll probably come across is called a large body. They can hit pretty hard, they can slide around on their tummies, closing large gaps, and can knock you back. They are also somewhat immune to damage from their fronts because all of your weapon hits will bounce off of them. There are a lot of enemies that are immune to certain or all types of magic, and some that can chain stun you to death if you're really unlucky. Now, add multiple of those and some of the normal enemies, and it really paints a picture of how difficult some of these fights can be. Moving on to story bosses, most of these you'll encounter are actually really cool. The non-humanoid ones are usually much easier than the human ones, so let's talk about the non-human ones first. These enemies are usually really big and are built around or are straight up Disney characters. Sometimes you'll fight giant Heartless that are 100 plus feet tall, and sometimes you fight literal Scar from the Lion King. The humanoid ones are much tougher, 1 because they normally appear on the later end of the game, and 2 because they have very intricate movesets, stuff like very fast attacks or animations that bait out your block. These, in my opinion, are a lot closer to Souls-like bosses in how deadly they can be both stat-wise and mentally, but they don't hold a candle to the super bosses. Super bosses are all humanoid. They are all max level, 99. They all have their own combos. They have DMs, aka desperation moves, which normally tells the player that they're going into a new phase, and all you can hope to do is survive them. Some are faster than others, while some prefer range. Some like to block your attacks and riposte your own riposte. Each one has a unique mechanic that you have to deal with during the fight. Take Kingdom Hearts 2 Marluxia for example. He rarely actually damages the player and instead removes a counter from you. This counter is based on your player level, and once that hits 0, you lose. Now there's a light spoiler alert for you, but I won't be showing too much of some fights, just how fast they can kill you on max level critical mode. You don't need to skip anything, just close your eyes. Oh no! These fights will take everything you have, and some will take over an hour to beat. These super bosses are really the only reason I play these games apart from being too invested in the main story. Now, I can't really put into words how difficult most of these bosses are without comparing them to Souls-like games, but the final boss from Sekiro is a good starting point for most of the super bosses. There are a few that are much harder. Now, keep in mind that everything I just said about these bosses are on critical mode, being the hardest difficulty, but I want to point out that none of these bosses are impossible. Some you can cheese, but finding that out without internet help is almost impossible, and everything has been done before on level 1 runs. And that's how balanced this game is. You can complete the entirety of Kingdom Hearts 2 and 3 and all of their content at level 1 on critical mode. Because while the last ability is given to the player before level 60, all of the important stuff is given to Sora during main points in the story. Whether it's level 99 or 1, Sora's combo can still be the same. His magic gets upgraded to the same point, and the bosses will still kill you in one hit. You don't really need to grind to do everything, so there's no pressure, unless you want to get to level 99. The enemies do take a little bit longer to kill, but they're never sponges. The mainline games are so finely tuned, but unfortunately, the other games are nothing like that. And now we move to the cons. There are some bad things about these games aside from story stuff. First is the difficulty. While I just said that the mainline games are incredibly balanced, the other ones are horrendous in critical mode. Every encounter took like 10 minutes to beat because they either one-shot me or my damage was too low, and I did ones of damage per hit. And I mean every encounter. Just walking through the world spawning normal enemies encounters. At one point I just stopped fighting things because it took way too long to kill anything, so just play Kingdom Hearts 2 and 3 in critical. Everything else should be at most in proud. The second is the command menu. This thing is a piece of crap that is traversed through with the D-pad on controllers. I don't know what it is on keyboard, so good luck. If you want magic, you can only equip 4 to a shortcut, and then you have to manually go to the magic section for every single cast. It's not so bad, but against the super bosses where every fraction of a second matters, it becomes a real pain in the butt. It gets worse too because the attack button isn't actually an attack button, it's a confirm button. And if not on attack, you don't attack. It's a mechanic that you're gonna have to get used to, like it or not, because I think it's gonna stay, at least for the mainline games. I guess lastly, Sora sometimes has a chance to whiff attacks, meaning if you don't take the openings, you'll get smacked because you didn't stagger something. There's also a few mechanics I personally don't care for, like the flow motion in one game, or being forced to switch back and forth between characters in another, or the amusement ride moves added into 3 that made combat absolutely trivial. There's also the grind for the ultimate weapons, which are worse in some games rather than others, and might not even be worth it in some cases. I mean, every game has some criticism, and being extremely biased about the series, I'm sure there's a lot of stuff that I'm missing. Just a side note, Kingdom Hearts 3 is the last game made and came out in 2019, so your computer may not be able to run that. Every other game, though, is from a much older time or was originally a handheld game. On top of that, there is obviously the pricing, because these games aren't free. Thankfully, as I mentioned before, these games are complete, so there's no microtransactions or extra DLC coming or anything like that. The versions are all complete and have everything available to the player upon purchase, except the version unique Keyblades, so in Kingdom Hearts 3. So stuff like Xbox has their own Keyblade, PlayStation has their own Keyblade, Epic Games has their own Keyblade, and now Steam will have their own Keyblade. Now, if you're still skeptical, as this video I'm sure just wasted your time, the 1.5 and 2.5 version of the game usually went down to around 20 USD on Epic Games, and in my opinion is an absolute steal for 4 playable games in one package, 2 of which are some of the best in the series. Alright, that was quite a lot to go over. I'm sure this was an absolute mess, but I want to point out that all the music you heard in the video comes directly from the games themselves. I thought about mentioning music, but I figured to just put it in the background and let you decide for yourself. I'd also appreciate if you liked and sub, if you found any of the stuff I said helpful, and comment about anything that I probably missed. This video took forever to make, so any love would be very much appreciated. If you want more gameplay, I do have the entire second game on the channel for you to watch, and on that note, my name is XIII. Hopefully I piqued your interest in the series, make sure you go drink some water, and I'll be here when you tune in next time. Now go to sleep.